Welcome to today's Explainer. Today, we're going to unravel a seriously fascinating historical puzzle together. We are looking at one of the most ambitious yet incredibly short-lived military projects of the entire ancient world. It's this wild story of imperial overreach, everyday life at the absolute edge of the map, and a totally abrupt disappearance that has literally kept historians scratching their heads for centuries.
So if I asked you to name the final northernmost border of the Roman Empire in Britain, you'd probably say Hadrian's Wall, right? I mean, it's the famous stone barrier that everyone knows, and it's usually assumed to be the absolute limit of Rome's reach. But as you'll see, that common assumption is actually completely wrong. Rome pushed way further north, deep into the rugged terrain of Scotland to build an entirely new frontier.
Okay, let's dive right into this timeline to see just how incredibly short-lived this massive new frontier was. So Hadrian's Wall is finished around 128 CE. But barely over a decade later, in 142 CE, Emperor Antoninus Pius orders his legions to march north and start building the Antonine Wall. And then, shockingly, by the 160 CE, the entire project is completely abandoned. We're talking about a massive undertaking that lasted a mere 20 years. Why go through all that insane effort just to up and leave? Well, to answer that, we have to look at the evidence left behind.
Part 1. The Briginus Slab, a Roman distance slab.
Our starting point for solving this mystery is a physical artifact discovered way back in 1868. It was erected in 142 CE to mark the completion of a section of the wall, and it boldly declares that the Second Augustan Legion built it over 4,652 paces. But here's the thing, it wasn't just some dull gray rock. When archaeologists washed it, they actually found faint traces of red pigment. This proves these markers were highly colored, incredibly vivid, and designed to aggressively stand out in the Scottish landscape.
Now, what's really interesting about this is the sheer brutality of the imagery on the slab's left panel. I mean, this is pure, unadulterated Roman propaganda. We see a victorious Roman cavalryman literally riding down naked Britons. One is getting trampled, one is fleeing with a spear right in his back, and another just sits there in absolute despair. But look really closely at the last figure. It's a bound and beheaded Briton. Historians believe this specific super gruesome act was deliberately carved as a show of Roman contempt for the local Gallo-Briton tradition of head veneration. So Rome was definitely sending a very loud, very violent message here.
But then, on the right panel of that same slab, we get a completely different scene, contrasting the absolute chaos of battle with the ordered piety of Rome. It depicts what's called a suavi taurilia. That's a sacred purification ritual. We see a man in a toga, who is possibly the legion's commander, Aulus Claudius Charax, pouring a libation right before sacrificing a bull, a pig, and a sheep to the gods. The panel even shows musicians playing instruments. And you know, this was a very practical necessity to drown out the dreadful sounds of the animal slaughter during the ceremony, just making sure the whole solemn vibe wasn't ruined. This was the ritual undertaken before the wall was even built, basically to ensure the gods were on Rome's side.
Part 2. Life on the Wall, the Antonine Frontier.
Now, moving from a single stone slab to the massive physical structure it actually belonged to, a really distinct picture emerges. When we contrast the two great Roman walls of Britain, Hadrian's Wall is super famous for its extensive stone construction. But the Antonine Wall was different. It was primarily a turf rampart, built on a sturdy stone base, and topped with a really formidable timber palisade. But its true defensive strength was actually right in front of it, a remarkably deep and wide defensive ditch. So make no mistake, just because it was made of earth and wood definitely doesn't mean it wasn't a highly imposing, state-of-the-art military fortification.
And to maintain this 37-mile stretch, Rome absolutely did not hold back on manpower. An estimated 9,000 auxiliary and legionary soldiers were stationed across this new military zone. Their primary job? To project Roman authority and protect the new border against fierce, hostile Caledonian tribes to the north, like the Domnoni.
And this brilliantly illustrates what those 9,000 people were actually doing, which completely humanizes this frontier. The discoveries at the 17 to 19 forts along the wall are just amazing. I mean, they found leather shoes in sizes that prove women and children lived right alongside the soldiers. They found the board game Ludus Latrunculi, showing us exactly how troops passed the time. They even found cheese presses revealing everyday culinary life, and incredibly, hypo-cost systems. Yes, the Romans actually built underfloor heating at the absolute edge of the empire, because let's face it, wearing Roman sandals in a Scottish winter is a pretty bold choice. So, this was a vibrant, living community, not just some miserable military outpost.
Part 3.
The Great Retreat, abandoning the wall.
Which brings us to the climax of our historical mystery. The Romans had fully invested here, right? They had 17 heavily populated forts and a dedicated military way road for rapid troop movement. So why on earth did they leave? On paper, the Antonine Wall was highly strategic. Because it was much shorter in length than Hadrian's Wall, Rome could concentrate those 9,000 men much more effectively. It was arguably a way more defensible line. Yet, in the 160s CE, under the rule of Emperor Marcus Aurelius, the Romans just abruptly packed up, abandoned their forts, and retreated south back to Hadrian's Wall. Why give up a perfectly defensible, shorter border?
So the crucial point is that empires rarely make massive strategic shifts for just one reason. Historians generally point to a combination of three overlapping pressures to solve the mystery of this retreat. We're looking at the reality of the geography, the shifting needs of the wider empire, and the cold, hard economic truth of the region.
Let's walk through these theories together because they really show the practical limits of ancient warfare. First off, the Antonine Wall pushed the frontier incredibly far from the main legionary reinforcements and supply hubs, which were located all the way down in York. This stretched Roman logistics literally to the breaking point. Second, the northern tribes were uniquely fierce, and they persistently attacked this new, intrusive border. Third, the broader empire was in crisis. Emperor Marcus Aurelius likely needed to pull troops out of Scotland to fight his really pressing campaigns over in Germany. But actually, maybe the most important factor was the economic reality. Moving a frontier requires a massive financial outlay. Normally, Rome would recoup this by taxing the conquered locals, but the inhabitants here, they were relatively poor farmers. There was virtually no taxable wealth to justify the enormous expense of maintaining this military zone. Basically, it simply wasn't profitable to stay.
Part 4. The Wall's Legacy, a Permanent Scar.
So the legions eventually marched south, but they obviously didn't take the wall with them. Today, roughly 1/3 of the original turf wall and its deep ditch remains visible, carving a permanent scar of imperial ambition right through the modern Scottish landscape. As you walk those ancient turf banks today, it leaves us with a pretty profound realization. It's a literal monument to the exact moment Rome's reach finally exceeded its grasp. So what does this forgotten, grassy frontier teach us about the ultimate limits of power? Well, it reminds us that even the greatest, most advanced empires eventually hit a boundary, whether geographic, military, or economic, that they simply cannot conquer and ultimately cannot afford. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the history around you.